Stop explaining yourself to demons and people. In a world that moves too fast, where everyone seems to have an opinion, a defense, and a reason for every action, there is a secret weapon that many overlook: silence. It is in this noise, this never-ending barrage of words and justifications, that we must learn to recognize the quiet power of withholding our words. Silence is not a passive state, it is a choice. A choice that often speaks louder than words ever could. You might wonder, how can silence be powerful? In a culture where we're taught to speak up, to defend ourselves, to explain our every move, isn't silence just an act of surrender? The answer is no. Silence, when used wisely, is an act of strength. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. It's a choice to preserve your peace, your dignity, and even your strength. Jesus showed us the way. He taught us that silence, especially in the face of those who seek to twist the truth, is often the most profound response we can offer. In the Gospel of Matthew, we find a powerful teaching from Jesus that speaks to this truth. He says, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." Matthew 7:6. At first glance, this might sound harsh, even unkind. But when we delve deeper, we see the profound wisdom in these words. Jesus is not referring to literal pigs or dogs. He's using imagery to describe people whose hearts are hardened, whose minds are closed to understanding the truth. These individuals, despite all our attempts to share wisdom with them, will mock and attack what is sacred. And when we engage, when we try to explain ourselves, we are offering something precious to those who cannot receive it, and they will turn on us. Silence is your shield. It is the armor that protects you from being harmed by the misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and outright attacks of those who cannot comprehend the sacred things you carry. And even more, silence preserves the strength of your spirit. It's in the quiet moments that God speaks to us the clearest. But to hear him, we must learn to be still, to step back from the noise of this world. Imagine for a moment what it would look like if we truly embraced this teaching. How many battles could we avoid if we simply stopped defending ourselves to those who are not ready to hear? How much emotional energy could we save if we chose to remain silent, to trust God with the outcome rather than feeling the pressure to explain ourselves to everyone? Jesus modeled this beautifully. He did not waste his time trying to explain himself to those who were spiritually blind. When he stood before Pilate, falsely accused and surrounded by hostile voices, he chose silence. Pilate, confused by Jesus' quiet response, asked, "Don't you hear the charges they are bringing against you?" But Jesus, knowing that his words would fall on deaf ears, said nothing. And in doing so, he showed the world that sometimes silence is the most powerful form of resistance. This isn't a call to avoid conflict at all costs, or to retreat into passivity. Rather, it's a call to discernment, to understand when silence is not an avoidance of the issue, but a powerful statement that says, "I trust God to handle this." Not every battle is ours to fight. Not every person deserves an explanation. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in recognizing that we don't need to speak to every situation, to explain ourselves to every critic. Our silence becomes a declaration that God is the one who defends us. This wisdom is not just an ancient teaching. It is as relevant today as it ever was. In our world, where people are quick to judge, to misunderstand, and to attack, silence becomes a shield, a protective wall that keeps our hearts safe from the arrows of criticism. But this wisdom doesn't come easily. It requires a deep trust in God. It requires a willingness to step back from the noise and let God speak for us. This is where our strength lies, in quietness and trust. Isaiah 30:15 reminds us, "In repentance and rest is your salvation, in quietness and trust is your strength." But why do we resist this? Why do we feel compelled to explain, to justify, to defend ourselves even when it costs us so much emotionally? Perhaps it is because we fear being misunderstood, or perhaps we want to be seen as right in the eyes of others. But here's the truth. Silence is not the absence of action. It is the action of faith. It is choosing to trust that God will reveal the truth in His time. It is standing firm in the knowledge that we are His, and He will fight for us. There are moments in life when words fail us. In these moments, silence speaks volumes. When you encounter someone who is not ready to hear the truth, who is spiritually blinded by their own demons, trying to explain yourself is like casting pearls before swine. And in this we see the power of silence. We are not called to waste our energy defending ourselves to people who cannot understand. We are called to protect our peace and our wisdom, and to trust God with the rest. Welcome to C.S. Lewis. Here, you will discover the path to a deeper and more meaningful relationship with God. As we step further into the idea of silence, we must recognize something fundamental. Every conflict we face, whether with a person, an idea, or a circumstance, has a deeper spiritual layer. What appears to be a simple disagreement or misunderstanding is often the surface manifestation of a much greater battle. It's a spiritual warfare that many don't recognize because it is veiled in the ordinary events of our daily lives. The Apostle Paul understood this truth deeply. In Ephesians 6:12, he reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. This verse invites us to see the unseen, to understand that behind every person's actions, especially those who seem to oppose us, there may be spiritual forces at work. And if we fail to see this, we will spend our energy fighting the wrong enemy. In a world where everyone is eager to explain themselves, to justify their words and actions, we can often miss the reality that our opponent is not the person in front of us, but the forces behind them. This is why silence is so powerful. It acknowledges that the words we speak, the battles we fight, are not just between us and another human being. They are between us and the forces of darkness. Imagine this for a moment. You're in a heated conversation with someone, trying desperately to explain yourself, to make them understand your heart. You've been hurt, misunderstood, and now you feel compelled to defend yourself. Yet, no matter how much you explain, it feels like you're speaking to a wall. It's like your words aren't getting through at all. What if, in that moment, what you're really facing isn't the person, but something far more insidious, the spiritual forces manipulating their thoughts and actions? This is not to say that every disagreement is driven by evil spirits, but the Bible teaches us to discern the spirits at work in every situation. When you find yourself caught in a conversation where the more you speak, the more misunderstood you become, it might be time to stop and consider. Am I fighting the wrong battle? Consider the story of Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Luke. Scripture tells us that she had been possessed by 7 demons. Luke 8:2-20. These demons weren't simply passive observers. They had personalities and agendas of their own, influencing her actions and thoughts. When people spoke to Mary, they were not simply speaking to one person. They were speaking to several spirits at once. Each demon represented a twisted perception, a dark influence over her mind and heart. Think about this. When you interact with someone who is deeply influenced by negative or destructive forces, you're not just dealing with the individual in front of you. You're dealing with all of the spiritual forces that are manipulating their behavior. Your words, no matter how well-intentioned, will be distorted and used against you. This is why Jesus was so careful in his interactions with people. He knew that when he spoke to someone, he wasn't just speaking to them. He was addressing the forces at work in their lives. In Mark 1:25, when Jesus encountered a man possessed by a demon, the demon cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" Jesus didn't engage in a prolonged conversation. He didn't try to reason with the demon. Instead, he simply said, "Be quiet. Come out of him." Mark 1:25 taught it. Jesus silenced the demon. He didn't argue with it or attempt to explain his purpose. He rebuked it and commanded it to be silent. Why did Jesus respond this way? Because he understood that demons gain strength through conversation. They manipulate situations by gathering information and twisting the truth. When we engage in a battle with someone who is spiritually compromised, we risk giving them, or rather the forces operating through them, the chance to use our own words against us. Demons thrive on our words. They wait for us to speak so they can twist our intentions, distort the truth, and attack us with our own thoughts. This is why silence becomes a powerful spiritual weapon. As C.S. Lewis once said, "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them." Many people fall into one of these two errors. They either ignore the spiritual forces at play, or they become so obsessed with them that they live in constant fear. But the truth is that demons are real, and they are defeated. Our job is not to fear them, but to recognize their presence and resist them in the authority Christ has given us. Once we grasp this spiritual reality, something incredible happens. We stop taking things personally. We no longer feel the need to defend ourselves against every accusation, to explain ourselves to every person who misunderstands us. We recognize that it's not just them. It's the spiritual forces at work behind their actions. And in that moment, silence becomes not only a refuge, but a spiritual weapon. This doesn't mean we should become passive or avoid difficult conversations altogether. Rather, it means we should recognize when to speak and when to be still. In situations where the real enemy is not the person in front of us, but the spirit influencing them, silence protects us from being pulled into a battle that God never called us to fight. There is immense power in understanding that not every battle requires a response. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is stay silent and trust that God will take care of it. Silence is a form of spiritual resistance, a declaration that we trust God to fight on our behalf. It is all too easy to get caught up in the noise of this world. Everywhere we look, there are battles raging. In our relationships, in our workplaces, in our homes, and even within our own hearts. The constant pressure to explain ourselves, to justify our actions, to defend our beliefs, can leave us emotionally exhausted. But what if the true battle is not with the person in front of us or the situation we face? What if we've been fighting the wrong fight all along? In his letter to the Ephesians, the Apostle Paul reminds us of a profound truth. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the... Paul's words challenge us to look beyond the immediate, to see that the real battle we face is spiritual, not physical. We are not fighting people. We are fighting the forces that seek to destroy us through them. But how do we know when we are fighting the wrong fight? The answer is deceptively simple. When we feel drained, discouraged, and defeated, it is a sign that we are expending our energy on battles God never called us to fight. We may feel the need to defend ourselves, to argue our case, to explain ourselves to people who have already made up their minds. But when we engage in these battles, we often step out of the protection and provision of God. Consider the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. God had given them clear instructions. Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis 2:17. It was a simple command with a clear consequence. If they ate from the tree, they would die. Yet, when the serpent came to Eve and began questioning her, she engaged in conversation. She started explaining herself, discussing the command with the enemy. In that moment, she opened herself up to deception. By engaging in that conversation, she was drawn into a fight she was never meant to have, and the consequences were devastating. This story serves as a warning to us. We must be careful not to engage in conversations with the enemy, especially when it comes to defending ourselves or justifying our actions. The enemy does not need to convince us to sin right away. If he cannot get us to sin, he will keep us distracted, busy fighting battles that take us away from the spiritual war we are called to fight. Silence is often the best way to resist the enemy's schemes. The enemy, like the serpent in the garden, is clever. He will do everything he can to pull us into unnecessary battles. He will make us feel as though our worth is dependent on the opinions of others, that we must explain ourselves to everyone who questions us. But when we engage in these battles, we give the enemy a foothold. We waste precious time and energy defending ourselves when we should be focusing on the spiritual forces at work. This is where silence becomes such a powerful tool. By choosing silence, we remove ourselves from the battle of defending our reputation, our actions, or our beliefs. Instead, we focus on the real enemy, the spiritual forces that seek to destroy us. Silence allows us to refocus our energy on what matters: prayer, discernment, and spiritual growth. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "We must remember that Satan has his strategy, and we must not be ignorant of his devices. If the devil cannot get us to sin outright, he will distract us with needless arguments, battles, and conflicts. He will wear us down until we have nothing left to give. But when we choose silence, we resist his tactics. We stop fighting the wrong fights and begin focusing on the real war, the one in the spiritual realm. One of the greatest tools at our disposal in this spiritual battle is discernment. We must learn to recognize the difference between the battles that are ours to fight and the ones that are distractions. It takes wisdom and spiritual maturity to know when to speak and when to be silent. This is why Jesus was so deliberate with his words. He knew when to remain silent, and he knew when to speak. In Matthew 7:6, Jesus tells us, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. This verse is not just about avoiding conflict with people. It is about recognizing when someone is spiritually unprepared to receive the wisdom or truth we carry. If we continue to engage with those who are spiritually blind or closed off to the truth, we risk wasting our energy and exposing ourselves to unnecessary attacks. The enemy uses our words against us. He takes what we say and twists it, turning it into an attack, a weapon to further his agenda. But when we remain silent, we deny him this power. We refuse to play his game. Instead of arguing with those who cannot understand, we turn our focus inward and upward. We seek God's guidance and strength. We trust that he will defend us, that he will reveal the truth in his time. But how do we cultivate this kind of silence? How do we learn to resist the urge to explain ourselves, to justify our actions, to defend our reputation? The answer lies in our relationship with God. The more we trust God, the more we can rest in the peace of knowing that he will take care of us. When we fully surrender to him, we stop feeling the need to prove ourselves to others. We stop trying to explain our every move. We learn to trust that God will reveal the truth, protect us, and fight on our behalf. The more we practice silence, the more we begin to see it as a spiritual discipline. Silence isn't just about withholding words. It is about aligning ourselves with God's will, surrendering to his timing, and trusting that he will handle the battles for us. In those moments of silence, we become stronger. We preserve our energy. We refocus our hearts and minds on the true battle, the spiritual one. And when we do this, we step into a place of peace, knowing that God is fighting for us. As we continue to explore the strength that silence brings, it's crucial to understand discernment. The ability to distinguish between the battles we are meant to fight and the ones that are simply distractions. Discernment is the spiritual gift that allows us to know when silence is not just an option, but the best option. It's a gift that is developed through prayer, experience, and a deep trust in God. When we cultivate discernment, we stop wasting time on needless battles and learn to focus on what truly matters: our relationship with God, our peace, and our spiritual growth. Without discernment, we can easily be swept up in the tide of worldly conflict. Every person who challenges us, every situation that seems unjust, can quickly become an emotional battlefield. We feel the need to explain ourselves, to justify our actions, to fight for our reputation. But this is where silence enters the picture. Silence is not simply about withdrawing from conflict. It is about understanding the right moment to engage and the right moment to remain still. The Apostle Paul tells us in Philippians 4:7, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." This peace, which surpasses all logic and reason, is a result of trusting God enough to silence the voices of the world. When we are grounded in God's peace, we are less inclined to defend ourselves, less likely to be consumed by the need for approval or vindication. The more we practice silence and trust in God's plan, the more his peace guards our hearts and minds. But this peace doesn't come automatically. It takes intentional effort to cultivate. Every day, we are faced with countless opportunities to speak, to react, to justify ourselves. Yet, not every moment requires a response. Not every person who criticizes us deserves an explanation. Discernment allows us to understand which moments are sacred and which ones are distractions. When we discern correctly, we stop engaging in fruitless debates and instead focus on what God wants us to do. Spend time in prayer, seek wisdom, and trust that He will fight our battles for us. A powerful example of this discernment is seen in the life of Jesus. As He walked through the world, He was constantly surrounded by people who misunderstood Him, challenged Him, and criticized Him. Yet, Jesus didn't feel the need to engage with every person who opposed Him. Instead, He reserved His words for those who were truly seeking truth, and He remained silent when it was clear that no explanation would be understood. In Matthew 27:12-14, Jesus stands before Pilate, who is confused by His silence. Pilate says to Him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus remains silent. He did not waste His energy on someone who could not understand His purpose. His silence wasn't an admission of defeat. It was an affirmation of trust. Jesus trusted that His mission was secure in God's hands, and He knew that no amount of explanation would change the outcome. His silence was His declaration of faith in God's plan, even when it seemed misunderstood by the world. This example challenges us to examine our own responses to conflict. How often do we feel the need to defend ourselves when faced with criticism? How often do we engage in conversations that we know are going nowhere, that will only lead to further frustration and misunderstanding? The more we grow in discernment, the better we become at recognizing when silence is the best response. Silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's the wisdom to understand when God is calling us to trust Him with our reputation and to focus our energy on what truly matters. One of the most powerful aspects of silence is its ability to reveal the truth. In moments of silence, people's true motives often become clear. When we stop talking, others begin to reveal who they truly are. In relationships, in ministry, in all areas of life, silence often exposes the heart. As we step back, we give others the space to speak, to show their true colors. We allow God to work in the hearts of those around us, revealing whether they are open to truth or resistant to it. This is where the real power of silence lies, in its ability to bring clarity. We live in a world filled with noise and confusion, and it is easy to get lost in the swirl of opinions, arguments, and accusations. But when we embrace silence, we create space for clarity and insight. We hear God's voice more clearly. We understand the situation more fully. We begin to see things as they truly are, not as we have been told they are. Silence sharpens our discernment and helps us to navigate the world with a clearer sense of purpose. In the book of Proverbs we are told, "The wise store up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool invites ruin." Proverbs 10:14. This verse emphasizes the importance of restraint in speech. It's not that we shouldn't speak, it's that we should speak wisely, and only when our words can bring light, not confusion. The fool is quick to speak and slow to listen, but the wise person knows when to be silent and when to speak. When we understand the power of silence, we begin to live out this wisdom. The more we practice silence, the more we develop the spiritual discernment necessary to engage in the right conversations at the right time. The key is to recognize that not every fight is ours to win, and not every person is ready to hear the truth we carry. When we learn to discern the spiritual forces at play, we stop wasting our energy on battles that will not bring about the kingdom of God. Instead, we focus our attention on the eternal, the unseen realm, where God is at work in ways we cannot always perceive. When we remain silent in the face of opposition, we allow God to reveal the truth in His time. We trust that He will vindicate us, protect us, and fight for us. Our silence becomes an act of surrender, a declaration that we are not relying on our own strength, but on the strength of the one who is greater than all the forces of darkness. We often think of spiritual warfare as something dramatic, an intense battle between good and evil, between angels and demons. While these battles certainly occur in the heavenly realms, spiritual warfare isn't always something we can see or touch. In fact, much of the spiritual warfare we face occurs in the realm of words. The things we say and the things we choose not to say. Our words, our responses, our willingness to speak or remain silent, all play a crucial role in the spiritual battles that unfold around us. The Bible clearly shows us that our words have the power to either build up or tear down, to either resist the enemy or hand him a victory. Proverbs 18:21 says, "The tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit." In a world where we are constantly bombarded with the temptation to speak out, to defend ourselves, to justify our actions, we must remember that silence is a weapon in spiritual warfare. When we choose to remain silent, we deny the enemy the power that comes from our words. We refuse to let him use our own speech against us. Consider the way Jesus responded to accusations during his trial. When he stood before the high priest and the chief priests, he was accused of many things, yet he did not engage with them in the way we might expect. In Matthew 26-63 it says, "But Jesus remained silent. He didn't argue with the religious leaders or try to justify himself. He knew that silence in that moment was far more powerful than any defense he could give. His silence exposed the darkness of those who accused him and revealed their inability to understand his true mission. In his silence, he defeated the enemy's attempts to use his words against him." Silence in this context becomes a powerful tool of resistance. When we remain silent, we are not avoiding the situation. We are not cowering from the fight. Instead, we are choosing to stand firm in our trust in God. We are choosing to trust that He will handle the situation in His time, that He will fight the battles for us. Silence becomes an act of faith, an act of surrender. In the face of accusations, misunderstandings, and attacks, we refuse to engage in the enemy's game of manipulation. We simply trust God to speak for us, to defend us, and to bring about justice in His way. But why does silence have such power in spiritual warfare? To answer that, we need to understand that the enemy thrives on words. In the Garden of Eden, the serpent came to Eve and began a conversation. He didn't immediately convince her to eat the forbidden fruit. Instead, he asked questions, twisted the truth, and led her into doubt. By engaging in this conversation, Eve opened the door to deception. The enemy uses our words to manipulate, to twist the truth, and to distract us from the real battle. In our own lives, when we engage in unnecessary arguments, or try to explain ourselves to people who are spiritually blind, we risk opening the door for the enemy to use our words against us. Silence closes that door. It prevents the enemy from gaining a foothold. It keeps us safe from being manipulated by our own words. When we choose silence, we resist the enemy's attempt to draw us into conflict. We stop fighting with our words and instead fight in the Spirit. This is why it's so important to recognize when silence is not only a good choice, but the best choice. The enemy will try to provoke us, pull us into arguments, to make us feel that we must explain ourselves. But when we understand the power of silence, we can resist these temptations. We can stand firm in our faith, knowing that God will defend us. In 1 Peter 5:8-9, we are warned to be alert, and sober-minded, because our adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. The enemy is always looking for an opportunity to use our emotions, our words, and our actions to trip us up. But when we remain silent, we deny him that opportunity. When we choose to withhold our words, we show that we are under the authority of God, not the whims of our emotions or the temptations of the enemy. Consider the example of David and Goliath. When David faced the giant, he didn't waste time arguing with Goliath. He didn't try to explain why he was capable of defeating him. Instead, he said, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." 1 Samuel 17:45. David's silence in the face of Goliath's taunts was not an act of fear, but an act of faith. His focus was on God's power, not his own abilities. David understood that his battle was not with Goliath, it was with the spiritual forces at work behind Goliath. This is a key lesson for us. When we face opposition, whether from people, circumstances, or spiritual forces, our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against the powers of darkness. And when we engage in arguments or try to justify ourselves, we are fighting the wrong battle. The real battle is fought in the spiritual realm, through prayer, faith, and trust in God's protection. Silence becomes our weapon in that battle. It is a declaration that we trust God to fight on our behalf, to bring about victory in his way and in his time. In Matthew 7:6, Jesus teaches us, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs." These words may seem harsh, but they are filled with wisdom. Jesus is warning us not to waste our time and energy on people who are not ready to receive the sacred truths we carry. When we try to explain ourselves to people who cannot understand, we are throwing pearls before swine. And just as pearls are trampled underfoot by pigs, so too are our words trampled by those who cannot appreciate them. Silence, in this case, is the wise response. The more we embrace silence, the more we realize that it is not a retreat. It is a powerful stand in faith. When we choose silence, we choose to stand firm in our trust in God. We refuse to let the enemy manipulate us, to drag us into unnecessary battles. We trust that God will speak for us, defend us, and bring about justice in his time. In that silence, we find strength. We find peace. And we find the courage to face the real battle, the spiritual one, head on. There is a remarkable freedom that comes when we stop fighting battles that were never ours to fight in the first place. Freedom from emotional exhaustion, freedom from the need to justify ourselves, and freedom from the incessant noise that surrounds us. When we embrace silence, we step into a place of divine peace and spiritual strength. Silence, in its purest form, is not an absence of action. It is a conscious, intentional choice to step back and allow God to step in. We live in a world where our worth is often measured by how much we speak, how loud we are, how much we defend ourselves. People want to be heard, they want their opinions validated, and they want to feel understood. And yet, in all of this noise, we can lose sight of something profound, the power that comes from choosing silence. When we stop explaining ourselves to everyone who questions us, when we choose to remain quiet in the face of accusations or misunderstanding, we open ourselves to a deeper, more meaningful connection with God. It is in silence that we discover true freedom. The world may tell us that silence is a sign of weakness, that we must always speak up for ourselves, that we must fight to be heard. But God's word shows us a different truth. In Isaiah 30:15, we are reminded, "In repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength." It is in those moments of quietness when we choose to trust God instead of defending ourselves that we find true strength. This strength is not of our own making. It is a strength that comes from God alone, a strength that is made perfect in our weakness. When we choose silence, we give ourselves permission to step out of the whirlwind of conflict and into the peaceful presence of God. It is in those quiet moments that we hear His voice most clearly, that we receive His wisdom and direction. And it is in these moments of stillness that we are able to reflect on our lives, our hearts, and our actions. Silence becomes a space for self-reflection, a time to allow God to speak to our hearts, to reveal areas where we need to grow, and to show us the next step in our journey. This is what makes silence so powerful. It creates space for God. In the rush of daily life, it's easy to get caught up in the noise of our circumstances, to feel overwhelmed by the demands of others, and to lose our sense of direction. But when we choose to step back, when we choose silence, we make space for God to speak. We give Him room to move in our hearts and our lives in ways that we may not even fully understand. Jesus showed us the power of this when He spent time alone in the wilderness. Before He began His public ministry, He withdrew to quiet places to pray, to seek the Father, and to prepare His heart for what lay ahead. In Matthew 14:23 it says, "After He had dismissed them, He went up on a mountainside by Himself to pray. When evening came, He was there alone." Jesus knew that in order to fulfill His mission, He needed to spend time in silence and solitude, listening to His Father's voice. If Jesus needed time alone with God, how much more do we? In our busy lives, we often neglect this spiritual discipline of silence. We feel the pressure to constantly be doing, to constantly be defending ourselves, constantly be explaining our actions. But in doing so, we miss the deeper purpose that silence holds. It is not about doing nothing. It is about being still and allowing God to work in us, to transform us, and to give us the strength we need to face the battles ahead. When we learn to embrace silence, we also learn to embrace the mystery of God's timing. So often we want to know what is happening next, to have all the answers, to see the path laid out before us. But silence teaches us to trust in God's perfect timing. We don't need to rush or explain ourselves. We simply need to trust that God is in control, that He is working all things together for our good. This trust is not always easy. It requires faith, faith that God will defend us, faith that He will reveal the truth in His time, and faith that He will protect us from the lies and accusations of the enemy. But it is in this trust that we find the greatest freedom. Freedom from the need to control every situation, freedom from the pressure to constantly explain ourselves, and freedom from the burden of emotional exhaustion. C.S. Lewis understood this concept deeply. In his writings, he often spoke about the power of surrender, the need to trust God even when we don't understand His ways. He once wrote, "Relying on God has to begin all over again every day as if nothing had yet been done." This is the essence of silence, the daily surrender of our will to God, the choice to trust Him anew each day, and the recognition that we are not in control, but He is. Silence is not about running away from our problems or avoiding conflict. It is about choosing to engage with life in a different way. Instead of fighting with words, we fight with faith. Instead of defending ourselves, we trust that God will be our defender. Silence becomes a way to align ourselves with God's will, to trust that His plan is better than our own, and to surrender our desires for control into His hands. When we stop defending ourselves, we start living in the freedom that God has for us. We stop trying to prove our worth to others, and we start to live in the security of knowing that we are already loved and accepted by God. We don't need the approval of others. We have God's approval, and that is enough. Silence helps us embrace this truth and rest in the peace that comes from knowing that we are His. We've journeyed together through the transformative power of silence, and now we come to the final chapter of this story. As we close, it's important to recognize that silence is not just a tactic for dealing with the world around us, but a deeply spiritual act of surrender and trust in God. The world tells us to fight for our rights, to speak up, to justify ourselves at every turn. But God calls us to a different way, a way that, on the surface, may seem counterintuitive, but in reality is the path of peace and victory. No, silence, when understood properly, is not about avoidance. It is not about retreating from the world or pretending that we don't care. Rather, silence is a choice to trust God, to trust that He is sovereign, that He will fight our battles, and that He will reveal the truth in His perfect timing. It's the declaration that we don't need to defend ourselves because we know that God is our defender. We don't need to explain ourselves because we trust that God knows our hearts. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells us, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. This rest is not just physical. It is a rest for our souls. It is the peace that comes from trusting in God, knowing that He is in control. When we choose silence, we choose to rest in God's promises, trusting that He will take care of us. We stop striving, stop fighting, and stop feeling the need to constantly explain ourselves. Instead, we rest in the assurance that God has a plan for our lives, and that His plan is always good. As we reflect on this truth, it's important to remember that silence is not an abandonment of our responsibility. God still calls us to act when necessary, to speak when prompted, and to stand firm in our faith. But the key is recognizing when to act and when to be silent. When we trust God, we stop trying to manipulate situations with our words. We stop trying to force outcomes, and instead, we allow God to move in His perfect way and timing. One of the greatest lessons we can learn is the power of quiet obedience. This is a life lived in trust, where we do not need to constantly explain ourselves or justify our actions. We know that God sees us, He understands us, and He will reveal His purposes in due time. Silence teaches us to rely on God's strength, not our own. It teaches us to live with humility, acknowledging that we do not have all the answers, but that God does. We are reminded of the ultimate example of silence in the person of Jesus Christ. When He was wrongfully accused, when He was mocked, beaten, and ultimately crucified, He remained silent. He didn't defend Himself. He didn't try to explain why He was innocent. He trusted God's plan. He knew that His Father was in control, and He chose to be still, knowing that in that stillness, the greatest victory was being won. Jesus' silence at the cross is the ultimate picture of trust. He entrusted His life to the Father, knowing that through His death, salvation would come to all. Jesus didn't fight with words. He fought with obedience. His silence in the face of accusations and suffering was the loudest statement of all. It was the declaration that His trust in the Father's will was greater than any defense He could make for Himself. And because of his silence, because of his trust, the world was changed forever. As we close, let us reflect on the lessons we have learned about silence. Silence is not weakness. It is strength in its purest form. It is the strength to trust God, to surrender our need for control, and to let him fight for us. Silence is the wisdom to discern when to speak and when to remain quiet, knowing that in our quietness, God is at work. Silence is the act of surrender, the declaration that we trust God with our reputation, our battles, and our future. Take a moment now to reflect. What battles have you been fighting that God never called you to fight? What areas of your life have you been trying to control with your words or actions? Where can you choose silence and trust that God will move on your behalf? In quietness and trust is your strength. As we walk into the future, let us hold fast to the truth that silence is not a retreat. It is an act of faith. When we remain silent, we invite God to move in ways that we cannot even imagine. We stop fighting the wrong battles and start fighting the ones that matter. We trust that God will defend us, protect us, and reveal the truth in his time. And in doing so, we experience the deepest peace and freedom that comes from knowing that God is in control. As we reflect on the power of silence, remember that in each moment of stillness, you are aligning yourself with God's perfect will. Silence is a weapon against the enemy, a tool for discerning God's voice, and a declaration that you trust him to handle your battles. Embrace silence, not as avoidance, but as an active trust in God's sovereignty. Choose silence when necessary, knowing that God will defend you, fight for you, and bring his truth to light in his time. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this journey. What battles do you feel called to surrender through silence? Share your reflections in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the C.S. Lewis channel for more inspirational insights into your spiritual growth.